step forward for me. Watch the step.
Yeah, okay.
Keep your hands where they are. You're good.
Contact your team 6 at the door, 1 in custody. Copy.
Copy.
Door's clear. We're going in.
Cover.
At exactly 7:43 a.m., a black SUV with no markings rolled to a stop in a quiet Minnesota driveway. No sirens. No flashing lights. Just 4 doors opening at the same time. 4 immigration and customs enforcement agents stepped out together, moving with the kind of coordination that comes from years of doing this without being questioned. Calm. Confident. Certain they were in control. On the front steps of the house stood a woman holding her 7-year-old son's hand. In her other hand was a leather briefcase, packed the night before. She was dressed for work. She was about to leave. She had no idea that the next 4 minutes would permanently change the lives of everyone standing in that driveway. The agents believed they were acting on a credible tip. They had an address. They had a name. And they had the dangerous comfort of authority that had rarely been challenged. The lead agent raised his voice first. "Ma'am, stop where you are." He did not show a badge. He did not identify himself. And he did not present a warrant. Then came the words that would ignite a federal investigation and a $13.4 million lawsuit. "You're under arrest." The woman did not scream. She did not run. She did not argue. She stood still. Her son pressed against her side, already recognizing something the agents did not, because the woman they had just placed in their sights was Denise Richardson, a licensed attorney. A.U.S. citizen from Texas, and one of the most quietly formidable civil rights lawyers in the state of Minnesota. And the arrest they were about to make was already illegal. Denise Richardson was 44 years old. For more than a decade, she had practiced law in 2 states. First in Texas, where she learned civil rights law the hard way, and later in Minnesota, where she built a quieter practice that didn't draw headlines but commanded respect. She wasn't known for press conferences. She wasn't known for sound bites. She was known for records, for understanding how institutions move when they believe no one is watching. In Texas, she had trained under attorneys who treated civil rights law not as theory, but as inheritance passed down through courtrooms, through files thick with precedent, through stories of what happens when power goes unchecked. When she moved north, she brought that discipline with her. She wrote methodical op-eds, filed narrowly targeted lawsuits, and published legal analyses that named specific agencies, specific patterns, and specific failures. Over time, her work became uncomfortable reading inside certain federal offices. ICE knew her name, not publicly, not officially, but in the way institutions remember people who make their jobs harder. That Tuesday morning began like any other. Denise had been awake since before 6. Her son was dressed, eating breakfast, quiet in the way observant children often are. The briefcase by the door was already packed. By 7:40. She was stepping onto the porch, her son's hand in hers, breathing visible in the cold air. The walk to the car should have taken 20 seconds. It took less than 10 before the SUV appeared. And in that moment, before a single command was shouted, Denise Richardson understood something was wrong. Denise Richardson did not freeze out of fear. She froze out of calculation. In the half-second after the SUV stopped, she scanned what mattered. No visible paperwork. No badge presented. No announcement of authority beyond shouted commands. And most importantly, no warrant. The lead agent moved first, closing the distance with long, confident strides. His voice was sharp, practiced, and completely certain that compliance would follow. "Turn around. Put your hands behind your back." Denise did not comply. She didn't argue either. Instead, She shifted her body slightly, not away from them, but toward the driveway, toward the cameras mounted beneath the eaves of her own home. Her voice was calm. "Avon, precisi. I am a licensed attorney in the state of Minnesota," she said. "I am standing on my private property. You have not presented a warrant." The words were clear. They were measured. And they were being recorded. The agents ignored every one of them. One stepped to her right, another to her left. Hands grabbed her arms with unnecessary force, twisting them behind her back. Her shoulders jolted forward as metal cuffs snapped closed. The briefcase slipped from her hand and hit the concrete. Papers spilled across the driveway, case notes, filings. Months of work scattered like trash. And then her son screamed. A sharp, panicked sound that cut through the quiet street and echoed between houses. Neighbors began opening doors. Phones came up. Windows filled with faces. Denise Richardson was forced down the steps of her own porch, handcuffed. While standing directly beneath cameras the agents did not know existed. And in that moment, before the SUV door closed, the entire case against them was already being built. The agents moved fast after that. Too fast. They didn't pause to explain. They didn't look around. They didn't notice the phones already recording from across the street. They pulled Denise toward the SUV as her son cried out her name. Over and over. His voice breaking into panic. A neighbor from directly across the street stepped off the curb without hesitation. An older woman, still in her robe. Phone raised in one hand as she crossed the road. She reached the boy just as the SUV door opened. She lifted him one arm under his legs, the other around his back, and pulled him into her chest. Turning his face away from the scene, with her free hand, she kept filming. Denise did not look at her son. She knew if she did, she would lose control. Instead, she turned her head toward the nearest camera mounted above the garage and began speaking clearly and deliberately. She read the agent's badge numbers out loud. Each digit, each name, slow enough to be unmistakable. The door slammed shut. The SUV pulled away from the driveway and disappeared down the street. For a moment, everything went quiet. Then the sound returned softer now. The boy's crying, muffled against the neighbor's shoulder, papers fluttering on the concrete, a briefcase lying on its side. What no one in that driveway knew was that the house itself was still watching. 4 high-definition security cameras, 2 angled directly at the driveway, were recording every second, uploading automatically to encrypted cloud storage. And something else had activated too. In the pocket of the boy's jacket, a phone Denise had set up months earlier had begun recording the moment his scream crossed a preset threshold. Video, audio, time-stamped. By the time the SUV reached the end of the block, the arrest already existed in more places than anyone there could control. The ice processing facility sat on the edge of a commercial district, deliberately nondescript, gray exterior. No signage meant to draw attention. A building designed to disappear into the background. Inside, the lighting was flat and unforgiving. The air smelled faintly of industrial cleaner and recycled ventilation. Every design choice served a single purpose: to make people feel smaller than they were. Denise Richardson did not feel small. She was placed in a holding room and left there. 10 minutes passed. Then 30. Then an hour. No explanation. No access to counsel. No reading of rights. When the door finally opened, it was the lead agent who stepped inside, the same one who had grabbed her arm on her front steps. He sat across from her with casual posture, legs spread, hands loose, the body language of someone who believed the room belonged to him. He didn't begin with procedure. He asked where she was born. He asked about her citizenship. He asked questions she had no legal obligation to answer. Denise said nothing, not because she didn't know the answers, but because she knew exactly what silence did in rooms like this. The agent pressed harder. His tone shifted, less official, more contemptuous. At one point, he spoke to another agent outside the room, as if Denise weren't there at all. And then he used a word. Quietly. Casually. A racial slur. Dropped without hesitation. What he did not know, what none of them had checked, was that Denise's smartwatch had been recording since the moment she pressed it in the back of the SUV. Every word spoken in that room was being captured. Time-stamped. Uploaded. The place meant to erase her was documenting itself instead. And the longer they talked, the deeper they buried themselves. By early afternoon, something had changed inside the building. The questions stopped circling. The tone shifted. Doors that had stayed closed too long began opening more often. Calls were being made quietly at first. Then, with urgency. Denise Richardson sat exactly where she had been the entire time. Her posture unchanged. Her expression controlled. She had said almost nothing. She didn't need to. The evidence was already doing the work for her. Somewhere up the chain of command. A name had finally landed with the weight it carried. Someone had checked a license. Someone had pulled a file. Someone had realized that the woman sitting in that holding room was not undocumented. Not a suspect. Not a mistake that could be brushed aside. She was a U.S. citizen. Born in Texas. Licensed to practice law in Minnesota. And she was recording everything. At Patruszyptis Przecie P.M. The door opened again. This time, no one sat down. An agent stood in the doorway and told her she was being released. No apology. No explanation. Just a correction made too late to matter. Outside, a small cluster of reporters had already gathered. Drawn by the videos spreading online. Cameras turned toward her as she stepped out into the light. Denise did not speak. She got into a car driven by a colleague and said nothing on the ride. The only place she asked to go was back to the house she had been taken from. The reunion happened in the neighbor's living room. She dropped to her knees and pulled her son into her arms. He buried his face in her neck and held on without a word. For a long time, neither of them moved. The arrest was over. But the damage had already begun to settle in, and so had the consequences. 48 hours was all it took. By then, the videos had moved far beyond the neighborhood. They were on national feeds, replayed on screens inside the very agencies meant to enforce the law. What might once have been buried as an administrative issue was now impossible to ignore. The Department of Justice opened a civil rights investigation. The FBI was brought in to examine the conduct of the agents involved. And almost immediately, the story they'd told on paper began to fall apart. Investigators traced the anonymous tip that had sent ICE to Denise Richardson's home. It led through a chain of burner emails and forwarded messages, deliberately designed to look untraceable. But it wasn't. With time and forensic patience, the trail ended at a former ICE insider, someone who had left the agency under pressure 2 years earlier. Someone Denise Richardson had publicly criticized in a series of meticulously sourced legal articles. The tip wasn't intelligence. It was retaliation, a manufactured excuse to put federal agents on her doorstep and let force do what intimidation couldn't. Then came the second fracture, this one from inside the unit. The female agent, a 7-year veteran who had stood to the left during the arrest, contacted federal investigators on her own. She didn't start with that morning. She started with a pattern. Briefings where critics were named. Operations justified after the fact. Targets selected not for what they'd done, but for who they were. She had stayed quiet for years. But the footage changed the calculation. And once one voice broke the silence, the rest of the structure began to crack. The next collapse didn't come from investigators. It came from fear. The youngest agent, the one who had stood at the rear of the formation in Denise Richardson's driveway, was 26 years old, barely 2 years into the job, still learning where the lines were, and how easily they could be crossed. When federal investigators contacted him, he didn't try to posture. He asked for a lawyer, and then he told the truth. In a sworn written statement, reviewed and signed with counsel present, he admitted that the anonymous tip report had been altered. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough. A few added details. A timeline tightened. Specifics that hadn't existed in the original message inserted to make the tip appear credible. He said the encouragement hadn't been explicit. It never was. It came in tone, in expectation, in the unspoken understanding that paperwork was meant to justify actions already decided. That statement did more than implicate him. It confirmed that the arrest had not been a mistake, it had been constructed. By the time the confession was entered into the investigative record, the defense had lost its foundation. Criminal charges followed quickly. Deprivation of rights under color of law, false imprisonment, assault. And while the agents scrambled for representation, Denise Richardson was already preparing for the next phase. She wasn't reacting anymore. She was moving forward methodically, deliberately toward a courtroom where the evidence would finally be allowed to speak out loud. The trial opened on a Monday morning in late spring inside a federal courtroom in Minneapolis. The room was full, not loud, not chaotic, just heavy with attention. Denise Richardson sat at the plaintiff's table without expression. Her hands folded. Her posture steady. She wasn't there to perform. She was there to let the record do its work. The government's case rested on 3 pillars. The first was sound. On the second day of testimony, the smartwatch recording was entered into evidence. When it played, the courtroom went still. Jurors heard the voices they had already seen on video, now unfiltered, uninterrupted. They heard the slur spoken casually. They heard agents admit they hadn't verified the tip. They heard the tone shift from authority to contempt. None of it could be explained away. The second pillar came from inside the agency. The cooperating agent took the stand and spoke without drama. She described briefings where names were mentioned. Critics, attorneys, people who had made the agency uncomfortable. She described a culture where questioning orders carried consequences and silence was safer. Then came the third pillar. Evidence that had never been public before. 4 years of documentation. Internal correspondence. Pattern analysis. Case comparisons. It showed that what happened in Denise Richardson's driveway wasn't isolated. It was familiar. And for the first time, the courtroom understood that this case wasn't just about one arrest. It was about a system finally being forced to explain itself. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. By federal standards, it was fast, not the speed of confusion, but the speed of clarity of evidence that left little room for debate. When the jurors returned, the courtroom rose. The verdict was read slowly, count by count. Guilty of deprivation of rights under color of law. Guilty of false imprisonment. Guilty of assault. All 4 agents. The lead agent, the 14-year veteran who had ordered the arrest, showed no expression. But his career was over before the final word left the judge's mouth. Sentencing followed weeks later in the same courtroom, before the same judge. She did not soften her language. She described the arrest not as an error in judgment, but as a constitutional violation, a deliberate abuse of authority carried out in front of a child. The lead agent was sentenced to 5 years in federal prison. The second agent received 3.5 years. The cooperating agent avoided prison but lost her career. The youngest agent was sentenced to probation. All 4 lost their jobs. All 4 lost their pensions. And for the first time since that morning in the driveway, The balance of power had fully shifted. The criminal convictions were only part of the reckoning. Months earlier, while the federal case was still unfolding, Denise Richardson had filed a civil lawsuit against the United States government and the agencies involved. By the time it reached resolution, there was very little left to argue. Discovery exposed everything. The videos from the driveway, the smartwatch audio, the altered tip report, the internal emails that should never have existed. Medical records documented the physical injury to Denise's shoulders from the arrest. Psychological evaluations traced the impact on her son nightmares. Separation anxiety, a fear of doors slamming, of cars slowing near the house. The court heard his testimony in a closed proceeding. With every possible accommodation, he spoke quietly about the morning his mother was taken, about thinking she wasn't coming back, about not wanting to go outside anymore. When the ruling came, it was decisive. The judge awarded $13, $4 million in damages. The number made headlines. It became a talking point on cable news and in policy debates. But in the courtroom, there was no celebration, because the money wasn't a reward. It was a measure of harm, a formal acknowledgement, written into the public record, of what unchecked power had done to a family on an ordinary Tuesday morning. And that record could never be erased. In the months that followed the verdict, Denise Richardson did not disappear. She didn't retreat from public life. She didn't soften her voice. She testified before congressional committees reviewing federal enforcement practices. She worked with policy groups to draft proposals mandatory warrant requirements for home-adjacent arrests, independent review boards for tip-based operations, oversight with consequences that couldn't be negotiated away, quiet changes, written into dense language, the kind that lasts. The driveway in suburban Minnesota was repaved the following year. The cameras remained. In fact, they were upgraded higher resolution, wider angles. The same cloud-backed system uploading every 30 seconds. Denise hadn't removed them. She hadn't moved. Most mornings looked ordinary again. Coffee, briefcase, a child walking beside her. But the house carried something now that concrete couldn't erase. A memory of what happened when power assumed it wasn't being watched and what happened when it was. Justice. In this story, wasn't a single moment. It wasn't the verdict. It wasn't the prison sentences. It wasn't even the $13. 4 million. It was the accumulation. The cameras. The smartwatch. The phone in a child's pocket. Years of quiet preparation by a woman who understood that truth doesn't need volume to survive. It only needs to be kept. And this time, it was. If this story mattered to you, share it. Because somewhere, someone still believes no one is recording. And they're wrong.